Before we begin our work session this evening and I turn things over to my board colleague, Ms. Caldwell Johnson, I would like to read a statement as we have received many emails in this past week and I wanted to address some things. There is an old saying in government, show me your budget and I'll show you your priorities. Year in, year out, adopting a budget is the single most important action by a school board, especially ensuring the budget is aligned with our goals. Many of the challenges in developing a budget for Iowa school districts are predicated by two major factors outside of our control: the state education funding formula and low increases in SSA funding in recent years. At a time when expense rises faster than funding increases, it is virtually impossible to find cost reductions that will not impact people. After all, 80% of our budget, 4 out of every $5 we spend, is related to teachers and staff. The budget before us cuts nearly 20 positions, including 12 teaching positions. Of course, our budget is also directly tied to enrollment. Since 2018, our enrollment has dropped by more than 2,000 students. That has a direct negative impact on our bottom line and our staffing. As we consider the ways we balance this year's proposal budget, nearly half of the $9.4 million in general fund cuts are one-time items that cannot be repeated next year. That compounds the challenges we face and we will face next year, whether it's state funding or our own enrollment. On top of that, actions by the state legislature are threatening to decimate us. From the elimination of diversity plans to approval of charter schools to the real threat of public funds being diverted to private schools in the form of vouchers, support for public education, which teaches the overwhelming majority of Iowa's children, is under attack. Moving forward, we have an obligation to identify those levers that increase student achievement and make sure we properly fund them. That means a series of challenging discussions and the consideration, evaluation, and prioritization of all expense categories. This process doesn't end tonight or at our next board meeting, but is something that we need to be diligent about in the months and even years ahead, based upon what we have recently faced and may continue to face in the near future. The board recently adopted a guardrail which states the superintendent shall not allow the composition of the teaching and learning staff to diverge regarding demographics and cultural responsivity from the student population. Our school district is a majority student of color district, and our staff should be aligned with the students that we serve. We will continue to monitor to ensure the district is taking every effort to follow this and other guardrails approved by the board. The conversations we had over the last few months were never intended to create divisions in a district where staff at all levels are feeling both overworked and undervalued. The decisions we face are both difficult and challenging. Our student outcomes-focused governance model and board goals call us to use our resources towards the improvement of student outcomes at all levels. When the superintendent invited board feedback and ideas on ways to eliminate staff cuts, the board rolled up its sleeves and got busy. I know that the focus of our discussion caught you off guard. Please know that it was never our intent to blindside you or our line of questioning or probing nature of our inquiries. Bottom line, we all have the same goal for our district, which is to create spaces for our students to achieve, to be successful in the next stages of their lives, and make long-lasting contributions to the world we live in. Thank you for all you do for this district. There is much work ahead, but this board is committed to doing it all it can to ensure our goals are met and our resources are deployed to effectively address student achievement and outcomes. Thank you. I will turn it over to Ms. Caldwell Johnson.
Thank you, Chair Bradley. I think that it might help, and Tom and Shashank, I'm hoping that you guys are maybe prepared for this, but we did have the public comment period that concluded here in the last day or so, right?
Yes, sir.
And I know that you have provided to the board over the course of the last week or so a number of questions that were submitted by the public. I was hoping, just for the sake of transparency and for people who are in the audience that may not have either had a chance to review the presentation or look at the questions, that we might spend just a few minutes doing some 30,000-foot overview themes that we saw in those comments and questions, and then anything else that you'd like to share in that regard. So, Superintendent Ahart?
Yeah, so we've been we just closed down last night the portal for people to submit questions. As of that time, we got 29 submissions from 29 unique individuals, which actually equated to well over 50 questions, because some of our submitters had multiple questions. There were a number of comments shared that were basically comments and not really questions. The recurring themes, there's kind of a handful of recurring themes. One was about the $9.4 million reduction, and why is the state funding us the way that they have, sort of echoing a lot of what Chair Bradley just shared in her remarks. There were a handful of questions about the school stadium, not understanding that the saved dollars are a completely different bucket than the general fund dollars. There were some questions or comments rather regarding my resignation, some questions about specific budget terminology, some questions about staffing that ranged, that were kind of far-ranging in all sorts of different areas of staffing. There were a handful of suggestions for cost reductions, and some questions about the use of ESSER funds and how that impacts the budget picture for FY23 and beyond. So we have submitted responses to almost all of those. We're still working on a few of them, but by the end of the day tomorrow, all the questions that have been submitted will have a response attached to it on the website so that everyone can see it. Just to kind of walk through the protocol that we've used. We receive those questions through our website, and then the Chiefs team determines who is in the best position to respond, and oftentimes that's more than one of us because the nature of the questions. Each question or sub-question is assigned either to myself, Mr. Smith, Mr. Aurora, Ms. Tallman, Mr. Berger, and a handful of them were specific questions for the Board of Directors. From there, we work with the appropriate staff to come up with a comprehensive response to each of the questions. We review that with the Chiefs team to make sure that we're aligned and accurate, and then we post those responses. And the questions and responses were posted in batches rather than one by one, so it's easier for the reader, the frequent visitor of the website, to determine what they've already read and what are new postings since their last visit. Does that pretty much capture it, Shashank?
That is accurate, Tom. The only thing I would add is we had received around 29 questions. From those 29 questions, 7 were responded to yesterday. 9 were responded to yesterday and 7 were responded to today, i.e. they were posted on the web portal. There are 5 questions to the board, so once we have a response, we can post those. A few questions we can't even post because they were either comments or there were things which were totally unclear what it meant, and some of them had verbiage which we would prefer not to post. We understand the sentiments coming from the people, but the verbiage was not something we felt appropriate posting. I think other than that, I wouldn't have anything else to add, Tom.
Thank you.
I'd open up the floor for any board questions or comments on the
Oh,
public.
I'm sorry, if I may, sorry. I did send, excuse me, to the board some responses to some of the more detailed questions that we had not gotten to at the last meeting. We're all pulled multiple different directions, and the Chiefs only have an opportunity to get together all together at one time once a week. So I believe I dropped the ball on getting those responses to you, even though I had them prepared. So those are in your inbox right now. I sent those late this afternoon. And those are responses to the cost-benefit analysis of Virtual Academy, the questions regarding gifted and talented programming, the questions regarding print shop, the questions regarding Pepple and Pearl expenditures, marketing and communication, and I think that's it, yeah.
Thank you. Before we go to a more formal discussion of sort of the remaining outstanding issues from our last meeting, I want to open it up to the board for any questions, comments, or additional clarification that might be required from the public comment period. Any questions or comments on that?
No, I just appreciate the opportunity to give the community feedback. I hope next time we can just give a little bit more time just to make sure that they can process things accordingly. And I think the one thing and we all know this, but there continues to be confusion about different pots of money and how it can be spent in terms of capital assets and others. And that's just for all of us to remember. And you give the tutorial in the presentation, but we still get questions about the different pots of money and how it can be spent. So I think that's just something we all have to remember in terms of education of our community.
What changes, adjustments, or considerations for changes or adjustments were made based on the community's feedback?
I don't know that we made any adjustments for the specific to any of the community feedback that hadn't already been covered by board conversation. Is that?
So only thing I would add is a couple of points over here. One is based on the state code, we have to publish the budget 10 days prior to the board meeting. So once it is published, it is difficult to make adjustments. Second is, any district in the state of Iowa has a window. So if the board discusses and says on May 1st, Shashank, this so-and-so thing needs to be adjusted because this is what the board feels. On July 1, we can submit an amendment and incorporate that. So just because April 15th window is closed, that does not preclude us from not adopting it changing it, as long as we have the spending authority.
Yeah, so essentially what the most important thing that happens when the board adopts the budget is setting the tax rate.
Exactly.
And so whatever the, individual line items look like within that budget just can't exceed what the board has certified for the tax rate, because that determines what we have to work with for the upcoming year.
And we modify our budget every year. So just to give an example, in the next April 12th meeting, we would be modifying for this year's budget because we received ESSER dollars and spent ESSER dollars which we were not aware about. So last year it was a similar situation. So we do keep modifying our budget as the year progresses. And basically what the board is certifying on April 15th is the property tax rate, and I don't think so any of the recommendations is going to impact the property tax rate. So we still have a window of opportunity if we want to make any changes.
Other board questions on the public comment period?
Terry, if I might add, we actually haven't discussed this yet, but I do think that one of the opportunities for us moving forward is to learn from the timing of the year that we're discussing budget, and maybe operate a little bit differently in the coming fiscal year around how we actually meet and interact with our public much sooner in the school year around developing some of these questions, but then also, sorry, I don't know if that's my microphone or not, but then also developing a possible public-facing budget document that would allow us to get ahead of this, as you guys have also experienced too, at this time of year. All sort of scheduled meetings kind of go out the window at that point in time around coaching and support and performance conversations, so that we can get all these budget questions answered. And there's an opportunity for us to actually learn from that now and take these questions, because if we have them now, we're going to have them again. And so if we know that, how do we begin to build that out on the forefront and be proactive in our transparency and putting that out for internally as well as externally moving forward? Again, that's not something that we've discussed yet, but just listening to the conversation and being a part of this the last several weeks, I do think that that's an opportunity for us.
If I could add to that as well, just kind of off of what you said, Matt, I think too, as we talk more, but putting that in our monitoring calendar as well and having our conversations earlier, I think sometimes having these conversations in February seem to be late, especially if we're taking deeper dives into the budget. But there also is some information that I've received from our board coach that I'll send to you too, as we're looking at what our budget conversations will look like going forward, and also help us as a board do our job, which is to make sure that it aligns to our goals.
You know, the other thing that I would offer, and Shashank actually lifted this up in one of our very first budget discussions back in February, is just this cadence, not only of starting earlier, but creating the space to have the more detailed, multi-year budgeting conversations that we need to be having today, so that we can be prepared not only for next year, but the following year, because we know the trends. There are a lot of assumptions that we can build in now, and utilizing that process as a way to sort of front load our budget discussions, I think, allow us the opportunity and the space and time to get more deeply into the discussions. The other thing that I would offer is we've kept a pretty big list of things that we want to push forward, not only in terms of work sessions, but also in terms of budget topics that we want to make sure that we focus on. So I think we have a pretty good roadmap, and I think we're just going to have to really begin to think intentionally about how we fit those budget discussions into the other things that we've prioritized for the year as well. So, but thank you for queuing us up on that, Shashank.
And I appreciate you lifting that up as well, Matt. 29 questions and submissions, in my opinion, for a district of our size is alarming. We do not have the engagement in this process that we should, so if we could look at better ways to engage our community regarding this work, I would appreciate that as well.
If I could also ask, are you able to capture how many people reviewed the video? Because going back to when we had in-person events, there have been times I'm sitting in high school by myself because nobody's in attendance. And so I think the first time we offered this when the pandemic started, I am remembering you telling us, Shashank, that there was really strong engagement. And so not sure, maybe people are watching but not asking questions, but then there still is, how do we make sure that we are getting this information out to the public and they understand it?
That's a very valid question, Kelly. So we just got the analytics today, and on the Facebook, there were 9,820 views. On Twitter, 2,306 views. On the web page, there was 1,357 views. And the e-newsletter was sent out to 34,000 recipients between March 25th and April 1st. So a fairly large engagement. We had also pushed it out on the Infinite Campus and School Connects. We don't have the exact numbers, how many views have happened, but just with the above that I shared, we have had tens of thousands of views to what we have shared with the community.
And is the presentation available in different languages?
No, it's not.
So it's English only, so
It's
we're
English
not
only, yeah.
connecting with families who are non-English speaking.
It is in English only, to your point. Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's appropriate to ask this, but I think it'd be great, interim superintendent Smith, I should say, I guess effective June. If we could just think about how to get some board input, since many of us are out in the community and would be happy to give any thoughts or feedback on how to do more robust engagement, be a place where I think we can be really helpful.
Anything else? Okay. So I passed around my attempt to sort of summarize where we last left off with our discussions. And as Dr. Ahart has already indicated, in our email is a message that includes responses to cost benefit of the virtual academy, gifted and talented, print shop, Pebble, and marketing and communication. So I would encourage everyone to make sure that you review that. There certainly may be follow-up and/or additional clarifying questions. I would suggest that those be directed specifically to the superintendent. But again, I think that in this memo, we had suggested maybe establishing some dates certain for delivery, but since we've received those, I think that we can take those off our list and move forward with the other items if that works for everyone. Okay.
That works.
So I'm not for sure how we would like to proceed, but the remaining items that we had on our list of outstanding issues, the first is, are there additional non-teaching cuts that can be made that mitigate the loss of 5 elementary positions and 7 middle school teaching positions? The next item is restoration of the ELL position, followed by administrative pay freeze, suspension and/or elimination of TSAs. And then the final is a much more generic comment that I think is around how we better align our monitoring and our board goals to deliverables that either are or aren't or could be identified as budget priorities moving forward. So I'm not for sure what the pleasure of the board is with regard to how we tackle the remaining issues. There were some suggested courses of action based on general feedback that I heard at the board table and other comments that I received from individuals. So I am open with regard to how we would like to proceed with the remaining questions that are included in the discussion notes from our last meeting.
I'm always going to advocate for talking about the goals first. So if we could start there.
So I'm happy to start there. And for those of you that are listening, what we've included in this set of notes is a reference to our board goals. And I think that the board has expressed over the course of this budget discussion a little angst and concern about true evidence of the 23 budget supporting our board goals. And what I'm advocating for and suggesting, and I think it might bear some discussion tonight, is how we better align our monitoring with what's included in the budget. So I'd suggested that we might wish to consider a component of monitoring that includes the following questions in response to data. Please delineate specific resources included in the budget used to support this board goal. Second question, are there sufficient resources, financial or other, allocated to advance this goal? Yes, no, with an explanation. And then the third question, what additional resources, financial or other, would advance, accelerate the attainment of this board goal? So I think we can open it up to the floor for any modifications, changes. Again, this was just my attempt to jumpstart the conversation. And I think this is for us to decide how we would like to embed budget considerations into our monitoring process. Floor is open.
So have we received yet the answer to that? Have we seen a budget that actually delineates expenses based on board goals? I think.
Not seen one in detail, but we're working on putting it together.
Okay.
It's one of the things that's difficult to do. Pardon me. It'll be easier if we know that this is what's wanted on the front end, but we really need to break down, especially with our personnel. That's where it becomes challenging. How much of each funded person is, how much of each person's time is dedicated toward the goal. 80% of our budget is personnel. And so, I mentioned this before, keeping our class sizes to the level that we have at the elementary is specifically tied to the board goals, but we don't have a good way of showing that without fleshing that out. And Shashank and I have talked about how it is that we can set that up and get that to you, but we want to make sure that it's an accurate picture. The other piece I think that's important to include is there are a lot of things that we must do at all levels to ensure that we're meeting state requirements, especially, I'm talking specifically about offer and teach. So there are things that are not specifically tied to the board goals that we have to do in order to maintain our accreditation. and really are not options to reduce, because we need to continue to do that work. So having a better picture of where that investment in staff dollars is, I think will help the board see more clearly what, kind of where the options are for putting additional investment behind particular levers for the board goals.
I don't know about others. I think we're also looking for a recommendation from you to help guide us a little bit. So I think, our strategy at first was to get in there and say, we rolled up our sleeves and we found some things, and clearly we made a few missteps. And so I guess I'd ask, when you're going through this exercise and the answer comes back that, no, there aren't sufficient resources to advance the board goal, what recommendations would you give us as the leader of the organization?
Well,
Is that a fair request?
Absolutely it is, yeah. There are, as we've discussed many times, there are, we're in year 11 of record low funding from the state. We've peeled back the onion about as far as we can without directly impacting student outcomes. So I sent a message to the board a few weeks ago that kind of talked about long range. Those are things that we've not wanted to talk about before, but if we don't change the structure of the budget, in a foundational way that takes some ongoing overhead costs away, we won't get there. The reductions in middle school and elementary staff aren't something designed to accelerate progress toward the goal, but it is designed to keep our system operating and keep equity among staffing at all levels. We have to do, I wouldn't say that bringing those positions back also, at that level is going to make a significant difference in achieving the goals. What we need to do is change the foundational calculations that we have at the beginning of the budget year to say we have this expense off our shoulders and we can redirect those resources to better fuel the board goals. I mean, we're not at a place where we can, in my view, where we can be reducing staff further at high school. We shouldn't be, in my view, reducing it at middle school or elementary level. You'll see that we have increased instructional staff over time. I think you got that message with that data from Mr. Aurora. You can argue that we're heavy in non-administrative central office roles, but frankly, those are the things that people also don't want to cut. The wraparound services that we provide for students, a lot of those are positions that don't register as teachers, don't register as administrators, but we rely very heavily on them to make sure that we're keeping our students supported in a way that they can be successful with the goals. And that looks different in Des Moines than it does in Urbandale or West Des Moines. So we keep a very close eye on how much we're spending administratively, and by any meaningful comparison, we're not over heavy administratively at the building level or at central office, but the dollars are really tight. So if we don't have something like, I hate to say this out loud, but if we don't close some buildings so that we avoid all of those costs and then can redirect staff more efficiently at our existing buildings, we really don't have another place to go without sacrificing the quality of service that our buildings expect and the staffing ratios that we have currently.
Even with the budget and the calculations as they currently stand, we have some buildings that are providing skills block at our elementary levels that are seeing gains in their literacy numbers, according to our board monitoring reports. So how is it that some buildings are able to do that in the current structure and not all buildings are able to do that? Why isn't that being moved forward as a recommendation for every building to implement under the current structure? How is it that some buildings have that capability and others don't? And if it is working, why aren't we saying this is something that we need to make a priority for all of our buildings?
Yeah, I can jump in there, Tom. And you're absolutely correct. It is a priority, and we do have schools that are developing in their systems and their processes to implement with fidelity, a skills block universally every day. And so we have some schools that are further down the road than others, no doubt. Ultimately, the onus is on me and our team at central office to continue to provide that training, that support to school leaders so that they are confident and competent and be able to implement the skills block, again, with fidelity across the table. And so that's the opportunity I think that we have. So bear with me and tell me if I go completely array here, Kim. But the analogy that kind of steps into my head is this idea of a vessel, right? And this vessel has cracks in it. And so no matter how rapidly you pour the content in or what volume, if there's cracks in that content, you're going to have leakage. And that's what's going to happen. And so sometimes that's what happens. The cracks represent right now our systems at central office and our supports and how we're organized to provide that level of training, coaching, and support to school leaders who can then cascade that influence into supporting their teacher leaders and their PLCs and their classroom teachers so that we don't have leakage. It doesn't mean that the content is wrong, and it doesn't mean that the overall system is broken. It just means that we've got to be better in our systems of support from central office. And I'm not talking about just leadership and learning and teaching and learning. I'm talking about holistically. All departments, all on board with understanding. That's my job. That's my job to help support that and to help create that depth of knowledge and breadth of knowledge around why Skills Block is so important and what we need to do as an organization in talent and personnel, in business and finance and operations to know why that Skills Block is actually a lever in supporting our students' development through structured reading, right? And so that's where I come in my role to help us get organized around that specific aspect, in addition to the broader picture, right, of what we do in terms of structured reading program in elementary schools.
So
Did my analogy make, it's
It
off the
does.
top of my head, so I'm hoping it
Yes,
actually just made sense.
it makes sense. I'm just curious if the budget that we will be approving and moving forward with, if the dollars that are present allows for those structures and scaffolds to be put into place for success in the future year.
Yeah, and I actually don't know that I could give you the best answer right now. We can give you the best. As we're analyzing the data right now that's already coming in, we'll have a more accurate answer over the next couple of weeks. Right? And I know this budget's going to be approved here by April 15th. I can tell you right now that there's always opportunities to take our budget and to prioritize and move things around to make sure that we're meeting our needs. That opportunity always exists. It has always existed.
So as you were speaking, I added 2 more questions potentially to our monitoring. And I think these questions come up pretty consistently, but I'm going to suggest that maybe we make them part of what we do moving forward. What are the things moving the needle in schools that are meeting the benchmarks? And what resources would be required to scale in all buildings? So we sort of build those questions in to monitoring so we don't have to make sure we ask them. But I also think those questions not only inform where we're going with student achievement, but also how we resource it. Does that make sense?
And I appreciate those questions being added. I want to be really cautious of what it looks like from the standpoint of staff resources to answer those questions on a regular basis. So we've got to find the balance between the time spent to complete the monitoring that's necessary and the times that should be spent filling the cracks. So perhaps doing a staff time use evaluation coming up or in the next year to really look at how the staff is using their time and allocating their time and how much of it is being spent focused on the board and not on students.
Other questions or comments on board goals?
It seems that, given the tenuous state of our budget, the budget decline, we're never going to get an answer that says we have enough resources to nail the board goals. And so I guess I want to say that out loud, so we're setting our sights realistically and wondering how we should be addressing that. And I don't mean pick one board goal over the other. The resources aren't necessarily there, is what I'm hearing. And I'm wondering if others are hearing that too.
I guess I would disagree. I think that we fund what's important to us. And so then hard decisions have to be made. And they're not always easy, but if we want our kids to read, if we want them to succeed at math and be successful when they leave our buildings, we have to commit to that. And so I'm not willing to say, well, it's okay, sorry, you were with us for 12, 13 years, but you can't read. Like, we did the best we could, but we just didn't have enough money. I'm not willing to go down that route. I think, how do we think through this differently? And look for looking under every rock of how we can be successful and make sure our kids are successful, because otherwise we're failing them. And kids are here to be successful. I mean, let's face it, what's the number one reason a school system exists? It's to get outcomes for kids. It's not for the big shiny buildings. It's not for anything other than we're getting outcomes for kids. And so I would disagree. I'm not willing to give up on that.
Yeah, I think it's not going to happen in 1 year. I think the excitement, right, is for all of us is to say, let's look at the deeper cuts that are harder and think about this over a 3-year or 5-year period.
Yeah, I think our goals are, well, we won't recalibrate goals for another 2023, 4? Yeah. So we're giving ourselves time to hopefully get there. And if not, to challenge ourselves to understand why. Other thoughts on board goals? Okay. So I am going to go back to the comment around additional non-teaching cuts that can be made that mitigate the loss of 5 elementary positions and 7 middle school positions. My thought here was that it doesn't appear that unless we're willing to make some fairly significant changes, shifts, or cuts, that we're really going to be able to restore those positions. And based on what Superintendent Ahart has indicated and what I understand to be sort of the reality, no one will actually lose their job.
No one will lose their job. We've done an exceedingly good job of having no one lose their job, even in years when we've cut many positions. This is a reaction, as we've said before, to, and I can't remember now what the numbers are, Susie. What's our drop in enrollment at elementary level?
It was almost 200 students, and around almost 500 at the middle school level.
Yeah.
And so I would just add, we have these staffing and allocation discussions with our Office of Schools leaders starting in December. And the discussions are around, where are they seeing gaps in schools? What is the data showing? What concerns are they having? What are the adjustments that they want to make to staffing in order to address some of the needs that they're seeing, because they're boots on the ground, in the buildings, working with principals in the classrooms, observing instruction. And so those discussions are taking place before we ever run the staffing formulas and before we do any of that, so that we can design the staffing to meet the needs of the field. And so adjustments were made, and I think to Matt's point earlier when he was talking, or when the question came about, what are we doing differently? So at the elementary level, positions were repurposed, FTEs were maybe assigned a little bit differently in order to help create a reading expert in every building. I think Matt talked about last time having an instructional coach that is well-versed in early literacy that can provide a higher level of support to the building, because that's what we heard from teacher forums that were conducted in feedback that came from teacher groups, right? And so that would just be one example of that. So when it comes to reductions of 5 FTE at the elementary level and 7 at the middle school level, it could have been far greater based on the decline in enrollment, but we only made cuts where adjustments could be made and it didn't create a hardship. I talk to principals about that a lot when I'm running staffing plans, that we're never wanting to create a hardship in buildings, and we're wanting to make sure that there is adequate and equitable staffing from building to building. So if a child moves from one school to another, they're getting the same support and services. And I think we do an actually very good job of that. But with that being said, we make plans. So with the 5 FTE no longer at the elementary level, we've made adjustments for that, and plans are in place for every building. Everyone is staffed. And buildings have an opportunity to say, hey, if I have a hardship, this has created a hardship for me because my enrollment was down, I lost an FTE, and this is how it's impacted my building. We work very closely with principal supervisors, and sometimes they add back a little here and a little there to fill those gaps too. So everyone should be in a better spot. It's never, ideal when you never like losing an FTE, but buildings and leaders understand that sometimes their enrollment goes up, sometimes it goes down, and sometimes it's an added FTE, sometimes you stay as you are staffed, and sometimes you lose, so an FTE potentially. But we have good safeguards in place for that. I appreciate the help of principal supervisors. They're on top of that to making sure their buildings get what they need.
Susie, could I ask a quick question? You referenced 200 elementary students and 500 middle school. Is that what we are projecting next year for the 22-23 school year, or you're saying that's like
This year.
this year? Okay, so
Yes.
we still don't have numbers. I mean, October is our census date, but open enrollment applications were due April 1, is that correct?
I believe so. And so we do project numbers and we do roll them up when it comes to staffing. And literally, I'll give elementary as an example. We literally go building by building, grade level by grade level, section by section. Dr. Ahart mentioned the class size of 23 that we utilize when we run the formula. And given, depending at a grade level, it doesn't always work out perfectly like that. Some grade levels do, some are a little bit higher, some are a little bit lower, but that's why we go back and look to make sure that if there was a decline in enrollment and we take an FTE, potentially did that then up class sizes. And if it did to a level we're uncomfortable with, then we keep the FTE and it stays in place at the building. But we take the October official count number just so we're being consistent with how we're pulling the information each year.
So the suggested course of action is, as part of the budget process for next year, to develop a set of budget guardrails that allows us to be clear about the limitations that are put on options available for budget cuts. And it was suggested here that the limitation on teaching cuts, making them an option of last resort. How do people feel about that? There likely will be other components of guardrails too, but this one is specific to this particular topical area.
I would say, as I think about the conversation, I know we've all done a lot of reflecting on last week's conversation, and I think a big part of the challenge was syntax. And, we, using the word administrator means different things to different people. And so what I think would be helpful, if the management limitations report on employee treatment of employees is the way that we keep track of this topic on a regular basis. I'm just wondering if in the future we can use the same language, because exempt school-based is different than classified non-school-based. And so we were asking, at least I was, right? And I know sometimes I would say, and not principals. And it all got wrapped up together. And I just think that in general, so when we're asking questions about teachers, we're also trying to better understand, using the employee categories that you're using, we're clear on staffing. So the one question I would ask with regards to this topic is, and if you don't have it, if you could provide it, we know that 14 teachers is defined by this category, that those are cuts, right? So I get that there's, they're open positions, but in essence, what other positions, using this classification system, what other cuts are taking place, so we can better understand how it's impacting the whole education ecosystem. And if you don't have that, if you could just provide that, I think that'd help us understand where the sacrifices are being made.
If I'm not mistaken, I think that in one of the earlier sets of questions, in addition to the 12 teaching positions, I think it delineated 4.5 in, I'm not recalling it off the top of my head, a technology position.
Yeah.
I'll refer that back to
But just
you.
using, again, so we're all using the same language.
We
Let's agree to the language that we're gonna use.
Yeah, we can provide that same data with that vernacular. That's a good idea.
Thank you. Or whichever one you would like, but just, again, so we're clear on who we're talking about and who we're not.
So is there agreement that we would like to set up a set of budget guardrails for our 24 budget process? Speak now.
I'd probably like to have some more discussion about that. I will tell you, just from the training that we've received, I mean, it'd be a challenge to come up with that, so we'd have to be very particular about what it is we're looking at, and I'll defer over to those who have been trained too, but that concerns me just a little bit, so I'm not for sure if that's the direction to go in, but I'd offer Kim or Kelly to speak to that as well.
I'm happy to have an ad hoc committee and start drafting something up and have the conversation and see where we land. But I think it is, again, we've definitely gone down a bit of a rabbit hole from the standpoint of the board's role versus management role when it comes to the budget. And I'd like to, if we do create something, make sure that it gives us an opportunity to monitor in a way that is providing us with the information that we need without going down, and providing the autonomy to make the best decisions for various different departments. ELL is coming to mind, but letting the experts be the experts in their field and allowing us to monitor accordingly, and then not get into the thick of what is the management's role.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's really more about clarity going into the process as opposed to having to deal with things after the fact that we haven't made clear on the front end. And to me, this is about clarity.
And I would also say, and I know I wasn't the only board member who experienced this, but we came into the process so late without having given the opportunity to provide any feedback, that we were all encountering examples in buildings where principals and teachers were telling us about budget cut recommendations, and I don't think we look aligned. And so conversations like that, transparency of information sharing, things like that, whether those are guardrails or maybe it's a strengthened process that doesn't require a guardrail. There's a couple different ways to do it, but I think it's definitely a conversation that we need to have.
So creating the means to the end, and whether that's guardrails or something else, we can determine. But I think, again, the more clear that we can be, the better the outcome that we'll get from the staff in the budget, right? Okay. All right, so you brought up the next topic, Ms. Martirano, so maybe you want to speak to the restoration of the ELL position. there was discussion about that, and I think that we are open to how we want to proceed with that. The recommendation was the restoration of the ELL position. That was the consensus of the board a week ago, and then the reallocation of other positions created as part of the ELL redesign. So this is our opportunity to determine if that's the direction we want to continue to go or if we want to change course.
I'll be honest, I'm struggling with this recommendation. I think that we want to provide the proper supports for our students that are English learners. I don't think that this decision was made lightly based on Mr. Smith's conversation and the clarity that he provided last week. I think that it's been very thoughtful. It's my understanding that the curriculum team and the EL team now have a much more cohesive, comprehensive approach to supporting this work and these students. And after talking to some team members on the EL team and in the curriculum team, I do struggle with overriding what's been brought to us as a recommendation.
Other board feedback.
I would go back into my reflection from last week, and I shared with my board colleagues my lack of integrity of going into weeds at the board table, because knowing that's not our role, and that is not where we're supposed to be. And I've struggled with this one as well. And I, knowing that it sounds like the district has asked questions, they figured it out. My general question to them is, how can you assure we are going to get the best services for our English language learners, and doing so in the structure you are proposing? Because there's still an outreach person yet to be hired. Am I correct in that?
That is correct.
Okay, so we still have a position that will be hired in the, I don't know what you call it, if it's a department, I think. And so how can you assure me that ELL coordinator, the job duties that Pablo fulfilled will be maintained, whether we've got curriculum folks, but that we've got an outreach person that's really strengthened to support the work?
Yeah. Excuse me. I think my answer to that could be, I can assure you that each of those duties that were articulated within Pablo's job description as it was written are absolutely being integrated into current roles to provide a more cohesive, to Kim's point, approach to curriculum instruction and how we're actually serving students in the Tier 1 as well as the Tier 2, Tier 3 support services in schools. But my assurance comes in our ability to, as an organization, understand that this investment is actually designed to serve the students who oftentimes need us the most, right, in terms of language acquisition as well as content knowledge. And so the assurance comes in our ability to communicate this strategy well with internally as well as externally, and continue to lift up and ask questions of our students and our staff who are recipients and delivering and executing this plan with fidelity. We put metrics in place to make sure that we're living on the promise that we've actually just articulated to our families and to our students. I think the assurance comes into, I hate to say it because they're all sitting here, these are the assurances, right? I don't even need to look at them, I'm pointing at them. These are the assurances, right? Because these folks lead with heart, and they lead with courage, and they lead with a mindset that is unequivocal across the country when it comes to actually delivering on the best experience for all students, the most inclusive and just environment. And I know this is probably more than you're asking, Kelly. I know But that's what this is, right? This is about organizing around a just cause and creating an opportunity for folks to be inspired and to do the right thing, even when the right thing is hard. And so I'm not saying that this is going to be easy. And I'm definitely not suggesting at any point in time that this strategy should preclude us from absolutely and relentlessly pursuing a representative staff that looks like our students and our families. It absolutely should. This has to be a part of that. This is not an either or. It's not a binary decision. It is absolutely about creating a cohesive system for all students to be able to access that tier 1 grade level standard-based instruction, those skills blocks, those opportunities to engage in highly qualified IM materials. All of those things are components of this, and they all live together. And that vessel that we have actually got to shore up cracks in that, right? That's my answer, and those people are my assurances that we will deliver on that.
I would just add to that this is another one of those decisions. It's really difficult to make. And I can promise you that none of us, when we heard Pablo was leaving, would say, oh, good, now we can cut that position. That was not that was not the thought behind it. It was knowing that we likely are going to have another substandard, it's actually standard now, but sub-sufficient budget picture. And what's another way that we can, organize things differently, add some expertise. We happen to have 2 vacancies that gave us an opportunity to sort of, they gave us a little more flexibility to change how things were structured. But none of us were saying, oh, thank God, now we can cut that position because somebody left. And we don't need it. It wasn't that at all. We know we have another, $10 million to cut. How do we do that? There are a lot of things that we wouldn't do if we didn't have to pare down our expenditures, and there are a lot of things that we would add if we had additional dollars to put to it. So it's always this calculus of what can we do central office wise to lessen our impact on the budget and maintain services to our schools and to our students.
Could I also add that, we are required to have a service model for ELL students based on their language level and the amount of additional support that they receive throughout the instructional day or instructional week. A little bit more or a little bit less depending on what your language level is. We have ELL staff in buildings. That has been increased a little bit due to funding out of the ELL budget in order to provide a better level of support, I believe, more so at the secondary level. So there's still the ELL staff in the building that are designated to make sure we're following the service model, collaborating with teachers to make sure we're providing the right level of support and that they're receiving the resources needed in the classroom. But we have increased ELL staff a little bit at the buildings in order to make sure that we're addressing that.
And how will you maintain that quality assurance piece to know that, my understanding are the 2 positions, you're going to kind of split the curriculum and then you're going to hire an outreach person. So essentially there will be like 2 part-time people, right? Like 2 people that are kind of working part-time ELL and then a full-time outreach. Is that,
No,
maybe I'm misunderstanding how you're
No,
doing
so
this.
we've got 2 existing positions in the Director of Teaching and Learning. And so the curriculum instruction aspect that was articulated in the previous director role is being absorbed into those 2 positions, but not just one person doing K-12. It's 2 people that are currently existing, taking their expertise and utilizing what they have in terms of the teams and the instructional integration opportunity to drive that ELL support service model into our Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 classrooms, right? Obviously, based on, to Susie's point, the unique level needs of those students and their unique situation. That's the opportunity to take, that's that integrated service model that we could drive forward at an accelerated clip to be better for our students and families.
So for these folks that are now taking on this additional role, is that something above and beyond? And so now are they going to be stretched thin? And are we going to, I don't want to lose sight, right?
No,
That's my question. Are we going to push them to a point where,
That's a great question.
Maybe not.
It's not something that's above and beyond. It's something that's been, the work has been, for lack of a better phrase, separate, right? There's been collaborative conversations, but now the work is actually integrated into a single conversation with our English language learning coordinators, our curriculum coordinators, so that we're not sitting in separate rooms talking about a service delivery model. We're sitting in the same room talking about the same curriculum and the opportunity to serve our students more cohesively and more intentionally.
And how would you anticipate that outreach staff member becoming that collaborative partner as well?
Similarly, right, and so there's obviously a lot of work with our current community school coordinators and some of those support staff that we already have, and working closely with building leaders around the systems of supports that they already have with their families. And so there's some opportunity in that community outreach coordinator position to make some shifts, to make some changes, because again, we haven't hired for it yet. And there's some opportunities to continue to lift up where there's gaps in services for families that we can provide a more robust and intentional support.
Okay, final question. How will you know if we're not successful? So that's my quality assurance piece. So if something isn't working, how are you going to know and how are you going to fix it?
There'll be no change in the data. If there's no change in the data, then it's not working, right? And again, and I think that having those short cycle metrics of knowing, all right, what do we want to achieve in this change? By August, what metrics should we see moving? What do we want to see by October? What do we see by December? Having those short cycle and mid-cycle metrics is going to be important for us to know whether or not we're on track and that this strategy is actually meeting the needs of our students and our families. You have a second part to that question. And that's something that this team needs to come up with our students, with our families around what's that service model look like that says to students, this is working for me, right? Of course, we have the academic measures, and we want to see how students are progressing in their reading and their math, right, and their language acquisition. All of those pieces that we currently measure are still going to be there, but what else? What else would our families say is going to be an indicator of success and that I am seen, I am valued, I am loved, I am supported, both in school and outside of school? Those are metrics that we have to collaborate around and make sure that we're listening to our students and our families to say, yes, this is working for me. That's the opportunity I think this position has in terms of the family outreach coordinator. I love your question. I think it's the right question to be asking.
And if it's successful, you're going to see students moving up in their language levels, but also you need to know that, if students are being successful, they'll be exited out of the program. So a lot of the students that continue to be in the ELL program are ones that, would need additional services, but you can measure their progress and growth. And I'm sure that'll be one of the indicators that the team will be looking at for monitoring, progress.
I'm going to do my best to articulate a concern that maybe it's the ELL position or maybe it's more broad. I think about, was it Stacy Schmidt that spoke during the public forum, and I think about the issue she raised about the pipeline of talent and their lack of diversity. And look, we live in Iowa. We have, our pool of candidates is obviously smaller. I don't believe that you should pick somebody solely based on race. I think all of us would agree with that. I also think that if we don't start identifying positions and calling out that our staff structure in some form or fashion has to better represent our community, we are not living out the vision values of this community. I don't have a solution. I want to be really clear. I wish I had a solution. I think everybody in here, we all wish we had a solution, and I think there's a lot of steps and programs that we are trying to do to invite more people into teaching. I just think that I think your approach of holistic and bringing two programs together, that seems really smart. The struggle, I think, continues to be that this is also a symbolic position too, I think, in who it aims to serve. And I want to just encourage us to think through in whatever way possible that we are really digging into effective recruiting strategies and ways to think about how we can put people in positions to make sure we're doing our best to represent the community.
Absolutely, and I'd, love to have another time to be able to dig into our recruitment and retention plan, because we have done a lot of restructuring in the department to make that a greater emphasis and a focus of the work, and then we've been building on that each year. And so we have some solid strategies in place for that, and we've been more successful, I think, in some positions and at some times, and in others, better work needs to be done. But I would love to be able to share that sometime with the board, just so you can see how we do advertise and recruit, and then how we are investing in our own employees, starting with actually our students and building up from there. So I'd be happy to do that.
Other board comments on ELL?
I'll say something real quick. Just kind of piggybacking off of what Ms. Norris said as well. I will own that I went probably deeper into that conversation as well as needed to be, but I think the point is still to be made, and I've said this many times before, and I'll say it again. We just need to do a better job at making sure we have staff in our district that represent the students that we serve. And I don't know what that looks like and how we get to that point, even elevating the ones that we currently have, but I think that is super important. I come from being a member of Des Moines Public Schools, working in the district, but also attending the district as a small child. My principal was Black. My kindergarten through fourth grade teachers were Black women. And that impacted the woman that I am today. So that, I just want to make sure, I know how we said it may have came off not the right way, telling you who to hire, but I also think what we're trying to say is that has to be a priority. I can't continue to just sit and watch that we continue to hire people, and they're people that don't look like some of the people that are sitting here at this table. So I hope that is something that you will hear us on, and that you will begin to do something about that to make that happen.
I appreciate the effort to reassign duties and still serve students, families of color, with the purpose of obviously reaching our goals. When you point to this group, I don't see myself. And that means something. And if we choose to ignore that, we're failing our families of color as well, our kids. We have to hold ourselves accountable. And I've shared this, we have to be intentional. And that is hard, because that means to a certain level that we have to do things differently. It is easier to do what it is being suggested to do because it's just easier. I want to see myself reflected when I go to a school, reflected in this group. We have great people. Pero ¿dónde estoy? Where am I? Who are the people that are watching those videos, participating? Who are the people that are coming to speak? We had a family that showed up a little bit ago, and we said, come back in 2 weeks. ¿Por qué? Why? She didn't know the process. How can she be present if we're not making room for people to be present? How am I responsible? How are we all at this table responsible? The time is not tomorrow or 2 years and 4 years. Whenever it is that we think we're going to revise goals again, The time is now. The time was before. This is way overdue. Why is it hard to do the right thing? This is not about putting other people down that are experts in their field. That is great. I love being part of this district. I love being part of this city. I am here because I was supported by white people. But there's a lot more people like me that need that support. I was lucky. I was privileged. I was lucky to have the right people around me. We can come up with justifications, excuses, and we can say we're focused on goals. Yes, so am I. But you know what? I have kids. I will continue to see myself not present. And that's not fair. Because my community is the largest in our district. We know this, yes? Sí. ¿Y dónde estoy? And where am I? My heart is beating hard right now. And it makes me want to cry because it is a disappointment that here we are fighting about one position, una posición, one position. ¿En serio? Seriously? This is where we want to invest our time? How long have we been talking about this subject? And here we are. This is like the third time we talk about it. It's time. Let's give people a chance. Give me a chance. Thank you.
Any other board comments on the ELL position? I'd like to maybe take a poll because we did have consensus before this meeting that we were going to restore the position. And I heard a little bit of dissension in that previous discussion tonight. Ms. Alonso-Diaz, I appreciate your passion around this issue. I've been around this board for longer than anybody else on this dais, even our superintendent. Probably not as long as Susie or a few other people in the audience. But I'm telling you, we have this conversation all the time. And in my 15 years on this board, we haven't progressed, we have regressed. To Dewana's point, there was a time when we had principals in multiple buildings, teachers in multiple buildings, administrators in our main office. And it's almost as if we've either thrown up our hands and say, oh, it's too hard, or we've just decided that it's not worth it. And I don't think it's not worth it. I think it is. Our kids deserve it. Our community is calling for it. You don't know how many phone calls I received this week just about the notion of not only the ELL discussion, but the larger discussion around diversity. I know we can do better, but you know what? We got to be committed to it, and we've got to articulate that as a value. And we can't walk away from it. We can't continue to settle for the status quo. We have to be committed to it. And at this board table, we have a few decisions that we can make around these issues. I think we can also set the stage for what our expectation is around these issues, which we've actually already done in our guardrails. So I'm not for sure exactly how we get ourselves from going down this rabbit hole, but boy, oh boy, the fact that we've had this conversation to me is a sign that we get it. And we know we have to do better, but is this where we're going to start doing it? To me, that's the question. I'm happy to do a poll. I'm facilitating the discussion. Tell me where you want to go.
I guess I would like to hear from board colleagues if you would like to, as Matt has said, they're going to hire an outreach person to go in that direction, knowing that we do have a guardrail that will be monitoring as far as making sure that we have staff that represent the demographics of our district. How are we feeling in moving that direction? Or are you wanting to implement that we have an ELL director?
Are we just saying if our position has changed from last week? My position has not changed from last week.
Mine hasn't either.
La mía tampoco. Mine hasn't either.
It's a hard one to be in because I know in SOFG, that's not where we should go. But I also absolutely am supportive of Maria, what you just shared, the heartfelt comments and your feelings are so important because our community needs to hear that. Our staff need to hear that. And, you know, with our chair, with Terry, this is a hard one to be in because I would absolutely say yes, but my SOFG training would say no. But I would go with the will of the board, but knowing that I'm in a split space based on that, but knowing that we do have to really be intentional in our efforts in identifying staff that look like our students, and we need to do better. I think that's just it. That's all I can say at this point.
If I may say something else, compañera Kelly, I think that as a district, we have gone in directions that we should not have gone many a times. SOFG work is important. And it's definitely about the success of our students. We cannot say we cannot go in this direction because as a district, I've only been here a few months, but I haven't heard that it's gone in all the right directions. In fact, I think it's been the opposite. Hence our conversation here tonight. Gracias, thank you.
I will go with a suggested course of action and just perhaps I'm the ELL director position, the way it existed when it was last seated is not going to accomplish what we've talked about here at the table tonight. And so restoring this position is not going to move us in the direction of having a more diverse and inclusive staff, unless there's something that I don't know about in that job description. And so I would just say, if we restore that position, we also need to, like, in my mind, they're two different things. We also need to be monitoring the guardrail that we've set in place. Or rewrite that director position so that it allows for improving the work that has already begun regarding moving in that more diverse and inclusive environment. So yeah, I will go with the will of the board on this, and certainly agree with all that you've said, Maria and Jackie and all of my board colleagues. We have to do better, and I hope that the path that we're headed down with regards to our guardrails will take us there. and I hope that we hold ourselves accountable to that work.
Would it be helpful just to maybe move this conversation along? I think the staff has clarity around what we're interested in seeing here. Would it be helpful if we returned the final recommendation and design back to them and ask that they bring back to us how this will actually be reflected in the staffing and the alignment that is being proposed for ELL?
Yeah, and any other recommendations they may have.
Do you need any more clarity or more conversation, Matt or Tom?
I do not. Yep.
Okay. All right. Anything else on ELL? So I'm going to move very quickly to the last two items, and likely the two items why we have the largest audience we've had in the last 10 years with us tonight. Pre-COVID. So the two remaining items that we have on sort of our list of notes from our last discussion were around administrative pay freezes and the suspension and elimination of the TSA. And I think that the recommendation for both is the same. So if you'll allow me to read the recommendation, and then we'll consider how we want to proceed. So the recommendation is the removal from consideration in FY23 of the administrative pay freeze and the suspension and/or elimination of the TSAs. Consider as a budget cut of last resort without taking it and other benefits off the table for future consideration. So, how would you like to proceed?
I think that was well said, and I think we'd all agree that part of what we lacked was potentially a full picture of information with regards to the topics we were talking about, specifically with the TSA. So I support that we remove it from consideration for this year.
Let me also mention, I think there's one additional piece of data that we have not yet received. And so the other piece of this on the TSA is also reviewed data and comparable information provided by HR. And I know that we have it for teachers. We have not yet received it for administrators. But again, that's something that we can review at a later date as part of our subsequent discussions. So I'll stop talking
And Terry, you're talking about, when you say administrators, you're talking about the central office comparables.
correct.
I just want to hold us all accountable to using the same language, so we don't have a language issue again. But I think it is really important when we talk about this, so if we could all use the same categories.
Yeah.
So when we don't lump administration, we call them out in the specific categories that you recommend. Thanks.
Do those
calling those
categories
out.
that you're
Yeah.
referring to separate out direct contact with students and non-direct contact?
So the categories, and again, I'm trying to use the language that's in the management limitations in the monitoring report. So it's exempt school-based, exempt non-school-based, classified school-based, classified non-school-based, instructional support, and teachers. So I'm open to whatever descriptions that you want to use, Susie, on a regular basis. I just think there's been a lot of discussion, and we all need to use the same terminology when we're talking about any type of impacts to benefits package.
Ms. Alonso Diaz, any additional comments on this particular component of our discussion tonight?
No, thank you.
Ms. Sawyer?
I support removing it from consideration.
All right, well, I think that concludes the final things that we had remaining from our last budget discussion. I guess the only thing that I would offer at this point is that with the minor modifications that we've made, I don't know that there are any significant adjustments that the staff will need to make to the budget document moving forward. So I say go out and do good, and we'll be ready to approve next week. And the only other thing that I would offer is I appreciate the board giving me the opportunity to facilitate these fun conversations. I hope that I have done the process justice. I know that this was a hard year because we had 3 new board members that were coming into a process that they, number one, had not experienced, and number 2, a lot of information that for a lot of people was brand new. So thanks for bearing with us as we made it through, and thanks for the confidence that you've given in me to move this process forward.
Great, thanks for doing it.
If I can just have a point of clarification, will we be receiving the document with the dollar amounts that you had discussed was still in draft mode prior to Tuesday?
Are you talking about, Kim, the budget presentation that I share with the board?
So not the PowerPoint, but the actual budget itself, the document that we are approving with dollar amounts and funds and...
So what?
We've received PowerPoints and we've received kind of high-level dollar amounts, but not the actual budget.
So the budget that we have published and what we have submitted to the state, I shouldn't say submitted, what we have published, yes, those numbers are there, very much there, which will show you for the large categories, showing both the revenues and the expenses.
Has that been sent to us already, Shashank?
No, it has not been because we were waiting for the discussion. It will be posted tomorrow on the board docs. So if you look into it and if that is what meets expectations, great. If it
Perfect.
does not, let me know and then I can send you that information.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And then can I just ask one other clarifying question on in the budget, does it actually address spending authority and the solvency ratio? Do you actually, when you give us the recommended budget, do you say it is estimated that our spending authority in this budget framework will be X by the end of the year, and the same thing with the solvency ratio? When do we find that out if that's not presented to us?
No, it will be presented, Jackie, to your point.
Okay.
It will be part of the presentation that I'll be putting on the board docs tomorrow,
Okay.
maximum day after, but most likely tomorrow. And that'll have all those details, not just the spending authority for next year. We will try to have a projection for the next few years so that we
Correct.
see where the trend is going, up or down, or whatever it is.
Correct, that's
Yes,
what.
absolutely.
Thank you.
That information will be there.
Hey, Shashank, just one other quick question, because I want to make sure I clarify, even for myself, what we should expect to see on board docs. So what we should expect to see is the document similar to what we produce every year that shows the very broad categories, like 10 or 15 of them. So it's not going to be in minute detail. It's not going to be the budget book that we typically get in July. It's going to be sort of that one-pager that the state uses to delineate broad categories of expenditures.
Thank you for clarifying, Terry. Absolutely.
Yes.
You're absolutely correct.
Okay, just wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page on that, so we're not creating an expectation and everybody's like, but no, I thought I was going to get X.
No, I appreciate that clarification, Terry.
Perfect.
I appreciate that.
Thank you.
And if not hearing anything else, I again want to personally thank you, Ms. Caldwell-Johnson, for taking us and facilitating these budget discussions that we've put in many hours. I also want to thank my board colleagues for giving of your time as we've gone through it, and thank you all who are here this evening, and we hope to see you back, and our work session is now adjourned.